We have a slight programming change. This morning, we were slated to have a couple of our colleagues from a university in Guatemala that we have been very fortunate to start building a partnership with. And if you've been following any of the news, know about hurricanes there and some of the struggles that they're facing, so they were unable to make it. But we are so excited about some of the global work we have started focusing on, and especially what's happening in Central America, that we have assembled an expert panel who's going to talk about that for us this morning. So we're very excited about that. Jeremy, in a minute, is going to come up and actually introduce all of our panel this morning. And before we do all that, we want to show y'all a quick video that our colleagues from Guatemala sent for us to watch. So please enjoy.
Greetings from Guatemala. My name is Edgar Lopez, and I'm actually the Dean of the Health Sciences School at Universidad Rafael Andívar in Guatemala City. This is a Jesuit university, one out of the 3 Jesuit universities in Central America. Currently, we have at the Health Sciences School in Guatemala the medical career, also nutrition, nursing, and what we call technologies for health, in which we include therapies as physiotherapy and respiratory therapy. Also, we have a school of public health. In Guatemala, we are very worried about the nutrition problem. And this is not something that is going on today. It's a problem that has been on for many, many decades. And we feel responsible as a health sciences school to make any contribution in favor through our students, through our school, through the university, through at the different alliances as the one we're sharing with Baylor College to do something in order to improve the nutrition level. So we're very happy since we were contacted by Baylor College and get involved in this project called Guatemala Sin Hambre. I think just by the name, you can sense the importance of such a project, especially in this time in Guatemala in which that issue, it's a major issue actually among all the country. So that's what we are very excited in order to get into together with such a formal organization that can help us to help at the same time the country and develop a better life for those kids, for those people among the different cardinal points in the country which actually are suffering from malnutrition. We're grateful for Guatemala and U.S. administration's commitment to addressing food and nutrition insecurity as a public health issue. We're grateful for private partners, domestically and across the international community, coming together to strengthen food and nutrition security. We are also grateful for everyone attending Summit, continuing the work in their communities and unique context. Please enjoy this summit, and definitely we will be talking in the future, giving to you the results, preliminary conclusions, and the end of results of this important study, this important project that it's about to start. Thank you very much.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Good morning. One more time. Good morning. All right. It is great to be with you all again this morning. I hope you were able to get a little bit of rest last night. And how about Eugene Cho? Wow. That was phenomenal. I've known Eugene for several years now, And I knew that we needed to buckle up and have our seatbelts ready for last night, but I had no idea the ride that we were about to go on. That was absolutely phenomenal. And what a day. Starting off with the undersecretary, who's leading policy analyst in the U.S. before becoming undersecretary, and then hearing all of the great presentations that we were able to hear during breakout sessions, and then last night culminating with Eugene Cho. That was quite a day. So this day, today is a day that's going to have, it's got a hard act to follow, doesn't it? And but it's going to do it. Well, I'm excited to be with you this morning. I'm excited about our panelists and certainly this new partnership that we have with University Raphael Landivar. Proximity, as we talked about yesterday, Brian Stevenson says you can't solve a social problem from a distance. You have to have proximity to the problem. And University Raphael Landivar is the largest private university in Central America. They are based in Guatemala City, but they are the ones that set up all of the COVID responses all around the country. They've got campuses all around the country. They have proximity to the problem. And so we are excited to be in a partnership with them to be able to begin to think not only how do we respond to the crisis, the migration crisis, once families get to the Texas-Mexico border, but how do we go downstream and prevent it from happening altogether? I remember a handful of years ago, I was with Sister Norma Pimentel. She runs Catholic Charities there on the Texas-Mexico border. If you live in Texas, you know who she is. She's a legendary figure. And she was telling me about how she got into the respite center business. And she said that that some Border Patrol agents actually approached her and said, listen, we have an influx of child migrants that are coming into Texas right now, and we think we need your help, but we don't know what to do. So she was invited by the Border Patrol agents to go visit several detention facilities, and when she got in there, the children were just shoulder to shoulder. There were so many kids packed into a room that they all couldn't lie down at the same time. Now, many of the kids were caked with mud from when they crossed over the Rio Grande River into Texas, and they hadn't been able to shower, and they were just sitting there frightened, scared, not knowing when they're going to see their parents again, if they would see their parents again. And she was dressed in her habit, so she was, and the kids just would come up to her and they would tug on her habit, saying, "Ayúdame, ayúdame, help me, help me." Well, we have an office in South Texas. Deborah Franco works in that office. Her long-term colleague, who will be with us later today, is a woman named Dr. Elaine Hernandez. And Dr. Hernandez called me about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, after she'd helped us respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in Puerto Rico and other places around the country. In addition to what she was doing on the border, she called and she said, "Listen, I'm retiring." And we were like, "No way, Elaine, you've got more energy than I do. You have more energy now than I did when I was 25. How are you retiring?" And she said, "Listen, I'm tired of addressing the migrant crisis when it gets here. I'm retiring to move to Honduras so that I can try to prevent the migrant crisis from ever happening." So in her retirement, she moved to an area that had been ravaged by Category 5 hurricanes, into a city that had the highest murder rate in the world. Well, it doesn't have to be this way. I think that's part of the theme that we're hearing from Stacy and Eugene and all of the powerful presenters that we've heard so far. It doesn't have to be this way. We have the capacity to solve a lot of these big major social issues that have been plaguing us for generations. we have the capacity if we work together. When we see government and nonprofit organizations and faith communities working alongside industry and academia, that we have the capacity to transform systems so that people don't have to make a 2,000-mile journey to the Texas-Mexico border for safety and security, with a sense of anticipation that they might be able to find jobs and feed their family. So I'm going to welcome our panel. Our panelists are experts in helping us learn how to address this issue downstream. The panel is going to be facilitated by our professor, our Honors College professor, and author, and public intellectual Matthew Whelan. And so we are glad that Matthew is one of the team members on our Global Migration Project here at Baylor. Our other panelists will be Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships, David Austin, with the World Food Program. And you're going to learn a little bit about the World Food Program and find out the magnificent reach that they have and the magnificent goals that they have to try to address a global migration and a global hunger problem. We'll also have Emily Foxman. Emily is one of our policy analysts. She's been new to our team over the past year, and she is as sharp as they come. And she's really been the architect of us being, as an organization, being able to figure out how we are going to take our collective impact model to places like Guatemala and Honduras and Venezuela and the Sudan and everywhere else. And then you all know Dr. Victor Hinojosa, one of my close friends and a political science professor, and he is the director of our global migration work. So I'd ask them to come to the panel. If you would all welcome them with me this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for that introduction, Jeremy. I thought I'd just begin by making some brief remarks to frame our panel today. According to the United Nations' most recent State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World Report, global hunger is at record levels. The message of the report is abundantly clear. The world is moving further away from its goal of ending hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in all its forms by 2030. Many hope that as the world emerged from the COVID crisis, food security would begin to recover. But following a steep rise in hunger in 2019, in 2020, there was yet another rise in 2021. Just to give you some numbers real quick. In 2021, about 828 million people in the world went hungry, which was an increase of 46 million from 2020 and an increase of 150 million from 2019. In 2021, about 2.3 billion people, so about 30% of the global population, were moderately or severely food insecure, which is 350 million more than in 2019. The number of people unable to afford a healthy diet rose to almost 3.1 billion people, up from 112 million from 2019. And there's also a growing gender gap in food insecurity. In 2021, 31.9% of women in the world were moderately or severely food insecure, compared to 27.6% of men. And that's up from 2019 as well. So in short, the world is going in the wrong direction. But why? And trying to get a handle on that question is why we're here this morning. And we're fortunate enough to have an incredible panel of experts to help us. Just to introduce them briefly, Victor Hinojosa, he is the Associate Professor of Political Science in the Honors Program at Baylor University. He's sitting at the end right there. He teaches courses in political science and in the Baylor Interdisciplinary Core. He joined the Baylor faculty in 2003, and he currently directs the Baylor Migration Project, a social innovation laboratory at Baylor that's bringing together an interdisciplinary team of faculty and students to address the challenges of child migration from Mexico and the Northern Triangle of Central America. So that's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In collaboration with the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, the Mennonite Central Committee, and others, Dr. Hinojosa and his students are working to design interventions into this challenging humanitarian crisis. So Emily Foxman, sitting in the middle, is a policy analyst at BCHIP. She's been a Bloomberg Fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where she received a master's degree in public health and led a GIS collaboration to map regional food environments. Her work centers on food systems and health equity, addressing place-based disparities at the intersection of social determinants of health. Prior to Hopkins, she served as the program director and development manager at a Houston-based food access nonprofit and received a BA and a distinction in research and creative work from Rice University. She advises BCHIP leadership on various issues, including partnerships to increase food and nutrition security in Central America. And finally, here at the end, David Austin is the Director for Strategic Partnerships at the United Nations World Food Program. Prior to joining the World Food Program, he worked with such organizations as MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, Mercy Corps, and the United States State Department, leading a variety of humanitarian efforts, including hunger relief and business development in developing nations. He's a strong advocate for American humanitarian leadership and investing in young people to secure a robust and stable future. So let's dive right in. I'd like to begin by asking David to tell us more about the World Food Program. I realize that some of us might not be perfectly familiar with its work. It won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020, several years ago. So I'm wondering if, David, could you say a little bit more about what the World Food Program is, the work it does, and your role within it? You've got a mic. Great.
I've got a mic, and it's on. Great. So the World Food Program is an agency of the United Nations. And let me just dispel something right now, since I'm in Texas, and I grew up with a kind of a Hal Lindsey, Jerry Jenkins eschatology, upbringing. The UN is not really here to replace the kingdom of God. It's not. And as one of the Secretary Generals early on in the UN's beginning, a guy named Dag Hammarskjöld, he said, actually, the UN is meant to prevent hell on earth. And that's what we're trying to do. And when you deal in hunger in the places we do, you see that. We're kind of the last stop for the 50 million people who are listed in that report who are currently marching towards starvation. So we have 50 million people who are on the brink of famine right now. And as you know, that's a horrible, horrible way to die. And our job is to try to save those people. So the World Food Program, we are a branch of the UN, and we try to get food to people who don't have access to it. So right now we're serving about 138 million people in 100 countries of the world. 20 of those countries are in severe conflict. About 80% of our budget goes to try to serve the needs of those people, such as in Somalia, where we're feeding, I think, about a third of the country. In Yemen, we're feeding over half of the country. In Afghanistan, we're feeding about 14 million people. The other thing is, we are voluntarily funded. We have to raise all of our money. So we don't get an automatic allocation from the UN or from the US government. We have to compete for every dollar that we want to spend. We have to put in proposals to save the people in Afghanistan. And those proposals get reviewed by governments, but also by some foundations. About 90% of our revenue comes from governments. At the moment, we are raising $30 million a day. And that is half of what we need to raise to meet the budgeted needs of the people we're trying to serve. We like to say we're not your grandmother's WFP. We don't just provide food. We provide food in a context so that it is, in a sense, if you think of the value chain, we are the very beginning links in the value chain, and we want to make sure that our programs are designed so that our beneficiaries have a chance to move from being a beneficiary to being a producer or a consumer or a learner or they're building infrastructures in their community to bring access to markets. So I'll give you an example. In the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, where I was in 2005 on a mission, our team was distributing emergency food where there was a hunger crisis that had started in the late 90s. One of the things we did is we had them build 80,000 kilometers of terraced walls in the mountains. And those terraced walls then captured the rain so that the rain didn't run down the mountain, it grew grass. And in the Tigray, the communities there are mostly pastoralists. And so they raise goats, and those goats are able to then graze throughout the year. But to build those terraces, you had to build trails and you had to build roads. And those goats now go to market. And up until the recent civil conflict in Ethiopia that started last year, we've never had to do food aid there again since 2005. We also distribute our food in countries in partnership with the host government through schools. We're currently serving 15.5 million children a school meal in Kenya, in Uganda. Well, actually, Kenya just graduated. Kenya is the 40th country to graduate from our school meal programs, where the government now owns that program wholly as part of their national budget. So a government would ask us to come in and help. We design a school meal program. Within 2 years of the program beginning, half of the children have to be girls. So we are doing human development through the distribution of food. We're addressing gender issues through the issue of food. And we work so that every year the national government takes a bigger slice of the budget so that within 10 years, we're out and the government owns it wholly. We've graduated 40 countries through that program. We've got a new program that we're designing with 50 national stakeholders and corporations to provide school meals to 75 million kids by 2035 in the 30 poorest countries of the world, so that by 2035, every child in the world has access to a nutritious school meal. So like I said, we're not your grandmother's WFP. A couple other little pieces about us. 75% of the food that we buy is from developing countries. But to understand the impact of conflict, when there's conflict, we usually can't get food out of those places. So in Ukraine, where we had been buying half of all of our wheat and 80% of all of our vegetable oil for the Eastern Hemisphere, that door shut back in February. And so when the Black Sea ports closed, our operational costs increased $72 million a month because we had to go and change where we were getting our supplies. So we have 50 ships on the water, about 80 planes in the air, and 5,600 trucks at any given day moving food around the world. But we don't just distribute food because, like I said, we're not your grandmother's WFP. We understand that food can be disruptive into an existing market, and we don't want to suppress or depress the prices. So we have a team around the world, mostly headquartered in Rome. It's a team of about 200 economists and analysts. And in the 84 different countries where we're distributing food and cash, they look at what's the best modality. And so oftentimes it's creating a biometric card, and we put cash onto that card, much like a SNAP benefit here in the US, an EBT. And so like in the country of Lebanon, the 1 million Syrian refugees who are in Lebanon, where there's an existing functioning market for the most part, they can take their little cash card with their ID, and they can go to the market and they can buy certain items just like you can with SNAP. And we're able to track that money and see how it impacts the local economy. Right now in Lebanon, given its financial situation, WFP provides about 25% of the GDP into Lebanon right now. So that's a stabilizing force to the market. It's a stabilizing force to the government. Where you are able to address food security by bringing in food or cash, we try to bring stability. Because when we have stability, we have decreased migration and decreased political disruption. So that's a kind of a top-level summary of WFP. And my job is to find organizations, individuals, companies, academic institutions in the U.S. that we can that have a similar mission and help align them with our mission, and then bring them into a relationship or a technical partnership or even a financial partnership with WFP.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. Emily and Victor, you're not only working with the World Food Program, you're working with Rafael Landívar University in Guatemala and several other partners on an exciting project called Guatemala Sin Hambre, or Hunger-Free Guatemala. Can you both tell us about this project and its main goals?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So in partnership with Universidad Rafael Landívar, or URL, which is the largest private university in Central America. They have 35,000 students across 9 campuses throughout the country. They have the only internationally accredited nutrition program in Guatemala, one of only 2 in Central America. We are designing this new initiative, Guatemala Sin Hambre, or Hunger-Free Guatemala, to develop, test, and scale innovations to strengthen food security and systemic collaboration in Guatemala. And this project has really been born out of 2 core opportunities right now. One is that we're in this really unique moment where there's an ecosystem of local actors in country who have been activating these really creative, innovative projects in the food space to test out different models for strengthening food security as a key driver of development. And then at the same time, right, we're also experiencing this heightened need, Matthew, that you outlined at the head of this panel, where there are some extreme pain points. And we're seeing how it plays out within this particular context in Guatemala. And I'll give you an example of that. So in Guatemala today, Guatemala has the world's 6th highest prevalence of stunting. That's a measure of chronic undernutrition, low height for weight, 6th highest in the world. And so on the ground, what that looks like is half of all Guatemalan children suffer from malnutrition. And then zooming out, 1 in 4 Guatemalans, that's 4.6 million individuals, are experiencing food insecurity. And so up to this point, efforts to really sort of systemically address these issues have in many ways remained sort of top down and siloed across public and private sectors, international aid, and local actors. And so what we're seeing is there's sort of a lack of systemic collaboration, some siloed, multi-level decision-making that hasn't really come across those platforms, that has really sort of eroded our understanding of what is driving these impacts, what's driving these outcomes, and how can we together sort of come up with ways to effectively strengthen food security within this particular context. And recently, former U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker said, "The world doesn't organize itself. The world doesn't organize itself." So what Guatemala Sin Hambre is doing is, with URL and BCHIP as backbone support, we're bringing together public and private sectors. We're bringing together humanitarian aid, academia, industry, nonprofits, the faith community, all together to really launch the first Hunger-Free Advisory Council and Hunger-Free Community Coalition, Sin Hambre Advisory Council and Community Coalitions, to together with all of these partners at the same table, examine the root causes of food insecurity, identify levers for structural change, and then cultivate scalable solutions that can be not only replicated and scaled throughout the country, but also across global contexts. And so we're doing this through a 4-phase approach. The first is we're conducting a food security assessment. We're doing a landscape scan, creating a baseline profile of what are some of the gaps and opportunities in the food system today. And then in phase 2, we're hosting a summit very similar to what we're doing this week, where we're bringing together partners from across the country, from across the world, from across different walks of life, to share ideas and to brainstorm opportunities, to find and clarify targeted actions that we can come up with together. And then in phase 3, we're really honing in on what specific actions we can take, and we're creating and formalizing a multi-sectoral strategic plan. And then finally, in the 4th stage, we're moving into implementation. And implementation is not only developing interventions and policies, but also developing research and generating a new evidence base on how do we do this in a way that is data-driven, in a way that is equitable, in a way that targets not only the root causes, but also some of the spillover effects through really innovative interventions. So, Victor, do you want to talk about some of the interventions that we're developing?
Sure, thank you. So what's really exciting about that is the chance to develop these interventions, and as Emily has said, many of those we hope will come from this bottom-up approach that we're developing is you bring stakeholders together, get them in the same room, developing these strategies. At the same time, I think we already see two types of interventions coming forward. One is the need to maximize access to federal programs, which are chronically undersubscribed in Guatemala. 1.4% of Guatemalans are enrolled in federal food assistance. 4% of Guatemalans participate in the Bolsa Social social programs. Guatemala's school feeding program has the real potential to transform nutrition in the country, and it too is chronically unsubscribed. So Guatemala's child nutrition law envisions that every student will receive a healthy meal at school. And it requires that 50% of the food served to students be sourced to local farmers. But implementing that program has been a real challenge. Only 16% of eligible students are enrolled in the school feeding program. It has also been a challenge to actually source those meals to local farmers. If we could improve participation, both from students and from local farmers, this has the potential to improve the dietary and nutritional diversity of students, and also create markets for smallholder farmers who today lack markets for their crops, and they lack incentives to expand production beyond traditional subsistence agriculture, namely corn and beans. So what this has the potential to do really is to transform food systems and to transform local markets. The World Food Program has an innovation hub that has developed an app that would link school purchasers to local farmers. That would provide some transparency in the procurement process, but also give incentives to farmers to expand their productive capacity, knowing that they have a market to actually sell these products to students. So we think that there is real potential to expand access to these kinds of federal programs. Another intervention that we see coming is an effort to turn disaster response into long-term capacity building and long-term development efforts. I was really glad you got to meet Dr. Lopez in the video today. Wish he could have been here in person. But Dr. Lopez was named the chief physician of the metropolis of Guatemala City and was tasked with setting up Guatemala City's COVID response. One of the things that he did as a part of that response was set up a network of respiratory clinics throughout Guatemala City. Now what they are trying to do as COVID declines is transform those respiratory centers into child nutrition centers and use students from Rafael Landivar's nutrition program to provide nutrition services. We think this is an important intervention in and of itself, but we also think this could serve as a model for other work to transform disaster response into long-term resilience and capacity building. So,
Thank you. David, did you want to add anything to that? Are you good? Okay. In terms of the drivers, key drivers of world hunger today, a lot of people talk about a framework called the five C's, and by the 5 C's, conflict, cost of food, climate change, COVID, and corruption. So I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about how your work intersects with the 5 C's framework, and whether or not you find this framework generative and helpful for your work. David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I had mentioned 80% of our budget goes to conflict areas. So conflict is a driver of hunger. That we know. But we also know that hunger is a driver of conflict. So they feed off each other. So, in Northern Africa, where we have a few hundred field offices, we see where hungry communities, I mean, honestly, it's Boko Haram in Nigeria and Al-Shabaab in the Somali region. ISIS is coming. They come in. They recruit people with food. And there's more recruitment through food and hunger. Hunger is the that's the factor, and food is the solution. But our field offices report back. So when we're not amply supplied, when we don't have the resources to fund our programs, the bad guys, they're getting resources too. So we compete. And most of the people that we serve, they want to build their communities. They don't want to send their sons and daughters off into these regimes. So conflict definitely drives it. You know, obviously you can see with the Ukraine crisis, we were buying the bulk of our commodities out of Ukraine, and that conflict is exporting hunger all over the world. One of the great things about capitalism is comparative advantage. The bad thing about it is that under the free trade system that's been growing over the last 40 years, is that about 90% of exported commodities are pretty much localized in under 10 countries. And Ukraine was one of those countries. So when you shut down that country, you significantly impact the supply globally of those commodities. And so the conflict there is driving hunger in Africa. So Africans, they import 30% of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And in a place like Egypt, where they import 80% of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and the cost of wheat has gone up 300%, and the government is subsidizing that, the government is weakening rapidly. Okay? It's driving hunger, it's driving instability. So conflict drives hunger, hunger drives conflict. We also know that hunger drives migration, and migration is a destabilizing force in a country. We know that from our research and from our interviews, people will move 4 times internally within their country before they'll decide to finally leave their country. But that creates, just like we don't, people in Texas don't always want people coming across the border, you also don't want people coming from California across into your border. It's the same thing, right? Those feelings are mutual, especially when you add additional layers of ethnicism or tribalism in other countries. So you can see how hunger can drive internal displacement and internal conflict, but also external. 5 million Venezuelans are residing right now in Colombia. Okay? That's destabilizing Colombia. Great little story. The minister I'm good?
Keep on going.
So the Minister of Education in Tunisia was up at WFP giving a report out on the instability of his country's border with Libya. And he had grown up in the 70s with a USAID-funded school meal program. And he got through school, getting school meals, and he would see those bags from USAID that said a free gift to the American people, and people shaking hands. And that was the background of their school kitchen. And one of the things he learned was that the kids who were in other tribes, they all came to the same table. And they learned how to be friends, and they built relationships because they were all kind of hungry, and they all saw those hands shaking, and they all learned how to be friends. This was the kind of the basis of his talk to WFP. And he said, now that we have instability on our border, and we are a middle-income country, what we've decided to do is fund school meal programs in Libya within 100 miles of our border to help prevent migration into our country. So as long as we can keep the kids in schools, we see that their parents stay, and their parents don't come over onto our border. So, this stuff is really basic. It is not difficult. COVID obviously disrupted a lot. I think a big part of COVID wasn't just the disruption of the supply chains and the closing of borders, but it was also remittances. In the first 9 months of COVID, $1 trillion of remittances were not sent. And so that has a huge impact into underdeveloped countries in terms of impacting their economies and the way that money would have rotated through the economy, but also when you have decreased income and you have fear and closed borders and reduced supply chains, we saw hunger skyrocket. And so that's why just coming out of COVID, when we had skyrocketing levels of hunger, this war in Ukraine really just was a gut punch. And it's created a very difficult situation, not just for the movement of food, but for the growing of food next year, the access to fertilizers and fuel. So it's a hard spot.
Thank you, David. How about you, Victor?
Thanks for that. So the C's sort of that I work most with are also violence, but also corruption and climate change. But one of the ways conflict works in the areas that I study in Central America, Latin America, is that conflict looks like strong organized crime groups that prey on civilian populations. So I'm sure you've heard about Central America's street gangs. These street gangs operate extortion networks in the neighborhoods that they control. And of course, transnational organized crime groups as well prey on civilians throughout the region. And that violence from non-state actors, from criminal groups, also drives hunger, drives food insecurity. One of the ways corruption works in the region is that states turn a blind eye to these violent actors, sometimes because they're on the payroll of the actors themselves, but other times because they're simply afraid of the violence that these actors themselves would unleash on them, right? Being a police officer is a very dangerous occupation in many places. Corruption also operates more subtly at local levels. I think we often think of corruption as a kind of convenience tax that rich people pay to get stuff done quickly, right? You need your thing approved quickly, you pay the convenience tax, or maybe it's a sort of tax that a rich person pays to get away with actions they shouldn't have been doing, right? Things they shouldn't have been doing. But that's simply not the case, right? Poor people suffer disproportionately from corruption. They are asked for bribes more often. They're asked for bribes that are a much higher percentage of their income than from a wealthy person. And this really affects their ability to operate. And for instance, if you have to pay a bribe every time you need to get a building permit approved to do something at your house or to add on to your business, or if you need to pay a bribe to get your business license or your business approved, those kinds of things can have a significant effect on people's livelihoods and on their ability to make ends meet. And look, sometimes governments are weak and inefficient and ineffective, especially at state and local levels, not necessarily because they're corrupt, but simply because they lack resources, they lack training, they lack capacity. So again, in Latin America, we often talk about a weak state capacity and even an absence of the state. The state's often not physically present in certain marginalized neighborhoods and in marginalized communities. In Guatemala, I'm thinking of indigenous areas where the state just isn't there. The other C that we're dealing with so much is climate change and climate extremes. So climate change is making traditional agricultural production much less predictable. Traditional crops grown in the traditional ways no longer sustain families and no longer sustain communities in parts of the world. Again, Central America's dry corridor is a classic example of this. And smallholder farms are hit especially hard. These smallholder farmers both produce much of the food grown in the region, and smallholder farmers are themselves more likely than the general population to be food insecure. The farmers themselves are at risk of food insecurity, and that's increasing because of the changing climate. And when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about increased temperatures and things like that. We're also talking about the increasing frequency and severity of climate extremes. Think about floods, storms, and the like, which also create significant displacement and disruption. 2020, Honduras was hit by 2 Category 4 hurricanes in the span of 2 weeks. It's the same region that just got hit by Tropical Storm Julia. That is creating all sorts of disruption, not just in agricultural areas, but throughout the country, which again adds to food insecurity and hunger.
How about you, Emily?
Yeah, so the final C is cost of food, right? And in many ways, this is sort of informed and driven by the intersections of the remaining 4 Cs. So by COVID and conflict, by climate change and corruption, we see rising costs in food. And for many of us, right, we feel the impacts of this every day when we go to the grocery store, when we go out to eat, when we go to buy food. But on the global scale, populations that are most vulnerable to food insecurity, right, so that's women, children, rural and indigenous communities, smallholder farmers, folks who are disproportionately navigating multidimensional poverty and informal employment, limited access to healthcare and education. We are seeing that it's particularly difficult to offset these rising costs and the heightened prices in food. And so what we're seeing is unusually high levels of food insecurity among these disproportionately impacted populations. And we're seeing some pretty stark spillover effects. So let me give you an example here, right? So in Guatemala, 80% of indigenous communities live in poverty. and 40% in extreme poverty, which is less than $2 a day. In rural communities, poverty is 50% higher than in urban areas, and extreme poverty is 3 times as high. So today, with these rising costs of food, right, and then the other intersectional challenges from these 5 Cs, we're seeing that only 3% of indigenous and rural children under the age of 2 have the dietary diversity and meal frequency that the WHO recommends. So what that looks like, right, is 97% of young children in rural and indigenous communities in Guatemala do not have the adequate nutrient intake, don't have safe, reliable access to meals that they would need to live an active, healthy lifestyle. And so while across the world, right, many of us are experiencing the impacts of rising costs of food, and that's a very real experience, we're also seeing the ripple effects on the most acutely impacted by food insecurity, on the most marginalized populations at a really stark level.
Thank you, Emily. I'm also wondering, as we're talking about the 5 Cs, whether there are any limits or gaps within this framework. And David, I'm particularly thinking about the UN reports on food security and nutrition repeatedly underscore inequality and poverty as also a key driver. I mean, you've commented a little bit on this in your remarks, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the summary of that report is, you know, everybody deserves access to an affordable, nutritious diet. That's everybody in the world. That's the baseline that we should be striving for. Everybody has access to nutritious, affordable food. That's our goal. Okay. In the northern part, in the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe, it's 1.9% of our population does not have access to that. Okay, and the cost for a nutritious diet per day in that region is $3.19 per day. In Africa, 80% of Africans do not have access to nutritious, affordable food, and the cost of a nutritious diet in Africa, on average, is $3.49. So it's about 15% higher in Africa than it is in the West to get a nutritious diet. And so, and the numbers are, you know, the percent of population. It's 1 billion people, 1.2 billion people, I think, in Africa. And so, you know, there is a huge inequality. So what are we trying to do about it? We're trying to increase local production. Africa definitely should be a food exporting continent. It has the resources, it has the manpower, it has the land, it's all there. And so helping empower that is one of our goals, as well as one of the goals of those reports. But we know that we can't do that without the private sector and without greater partnership from the governments.
Thank you for that. Several of you keep on talking about these spillover effects related to hunger and food insecurity, the way this looks on the ground, hunger driving, for instance, migration. Emily and Victor, your work deals directly with this. So I was wondering if you could speak, perhaps we start with you, Victor, more to the sort of the concreteness of the spillover effects of hunger in relationship to migration in particular.
I mean, sure, the short answer is one of the ways you cope with food insecurity, if you can't meet your basic needs where you are, is you move, right? And as David said at the beginning, your first move is to move internally within your country. The second move is often to relocate regionally to a nearby country. And then that migration tends to happen transnationally after that. Sometimes that migration is temporary. Sometimes you go for a time and work in another country and then come back home. Sometimes it's permanent. Most of the time, it's a family sends 1 or 2 family members abroad to send money back home, but sometimes entire families travel together. And the World Food Program and the work that David has done and his team, right, has shown a very clear link between food security and migration. And again, in Central America, in the region Emily and I work with, that has been especially the case, right? So a study that they did a few years ago found 72% of families, households they surveyed, had already engaged in what the World Food Program terms extreme coping mechanisms. They'd already sold land to try to meet their basic food needs. Right? Once you've sold land to feed your basic food needs, your further options are incredibly limited. And I do think we tend, as David said a second ago, we tend to underestimate just how disruptive this is and how traumatic this is for families especially, right? Families who are separated, families who have to move. We underestimate the trauma and the disruption that causes. But we also underestimate the disruption that causes for communities, both sending communities who lose people that they know and love and who are part of that community, and for recipient communities, especially if a recipient community has to receive a lot of people all at once. That's tremendously disruptive there. And back to climate change. I mean, folks, we know this is coming, right? The World Bank has estimated that by 2050 we'll see as many as 150 million climate refugees. Just by 2050. Most of those will be internal, but just because it's internal migration doesn't make it any less disruptive. Again, it will be disrupting countries. We know this is coming, and we have to help communities prepare to manage these new forms of people flows.
Yeah, and I think that's a link that's often overlooked is the relationship between hunger and migration. And David, like you were saying with conflict, where it's a reciprocal effect, right? Conflict drives hunger, hunger drives conflict. It's the same with migration. Hunger drives migration, migration drives hunger. And so we end up with these really complicated links that down the line have spillover effects themselves, right? We end up with higher healthcare costs. We end up with more people experiencing multidimensional or poverty. We end up with barriers to education and staying in school, the need to go work and participate in the economy to get food on the table, to earn. So I think it's a link that's often misunderstood.
Well, and to that point, if migration is unsuccessful, families are actually worse off at the end, right? So migration can actually make you more food insecure, right? It's a last resort, but it can be a last resort that actually make things worse.
Okay, I want to just throw in one thing here too. So 150 million climate refugees by 2050. We just hit 100 million refugees globally. People who have left their countries and are residing in other countries as refugees. That's the most since World War II. And that's where we're at the moment. And then the other thing I want to bring back to cost, when a Guatemalan crosses over the border into Texas and is detained, the Washington Post in 2019 did a report. It costs $3,600 a week to keep them in detention. $3,600 a week. Okay, we have programs in Guatemala that cost $2 a week per household that are ag development programs, and yet the funding that we get from USAID. Sorry to throw USAID under the bus here, but I'm going to take a plug. we get less than $14 million for Guatemala for our Guatemala work. You know, I think there has to be a greater contextual conversation about hunger in Central America and what the impacts are and how do we address it. Because I can tell you, spending time with Guatemalans, Hondurans, El Salvadorans, they want business investment. They want to develop their country. They don't want to be hungry. They want to be prosperous. And they want that investment. And I think we've got to find strategic ways to do that. Work a little smarter and not instead of working just harder at the existing problems.
Yes, thank you. So we've been talking about these questions at a global scale, big picture drivers, but I guess I'm mindful of the fact that we're all here not just because we want to understand hunger and understand its drivers, but also to do something about them. So I'm wondering if what kind of advice moving forward you have for ordinary people that want to get involved in these questions at this more global level. Do you want to start, David?
Yeah, so for ordinary people wanting to get involved, I would say make a friend on the other side. And make that friend, get to know that friend, spend time in their kitchen, understand who they are, meet with them over Zoom if you can't travel. But you get to know somebody on the other side, and their problems become your problems. And when you love somebody and they become part of your heart, then you change, and you'll make sure you'll do everything you can to empower them. So that's on a personal level. Institutionally, because I'm representing the institution, we do need greater institutional partnerships, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what we're talking. Your question is about what do we do as a person? Meet one of those friends. Sponsor a child. Write that child. get to know that child's family, invest in a person.
But also institutions. I'm also interested in the World Food Program in terms of what you feel like could be improved or changed moving forward. What you need.
Well, I think like a partnership with BCHIP to address a problem with their expertise in a country where we can use their partnership and access greater stakeholders to actually move the needle. That's what WFP is trying to do. We're not trying to just treat a symptom. We've realized that doesn't help. We have to be a part of the solutions, and we can't be part of the solutions without partners who can, if we're going to end hunger, that means we need an exit strategy. So how do we make those programs, the initial links in the value chain, that our beneficiaries are moving into those other links where they're producers and consumers and active participants in their civil society?
Thank you for that. How about you, Emily?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the same sentiments as David. I think, oftentimes when we're coming at this from perhaps a research lens or from practitioners, it's easy to talk about communities, but it's also really important to talk with communities, right? And lived experience is a key part in that. And I think one of the most disruptive things that we can do as individuals, as organizations, as communities, as nations and countries is organize. Right, is come together, is to pool our strengths and our research capacity and our resources and brain power to mobilize collective impact and to elevate our understanding of how we can systemically move the needle forward on some of these issues. And so whether you're in humanitarian aid or whether you're in academia, whether you're at a food bank in Texas or in community agriculture, we all have a role at the table. And I think we need to continue to come together to do the work to build out and reimagine how we configure our collective efforts and how we can tailor them to diverse contexts and replicate across the world. And then I think really strengthen the public-private infrastructure to do that.
Great. How about you, Victor?
Yes, what she said. So thinking back to the 5 C's approach, which I really do like, what's so challenging about the 5 C's is that you have to address all of them simultaneously, right? You have to address them all at once. You can't wait until you get climate or corruption under control before you start working. You have to start working, and you have to start addressing these issues simultaneously, which is why I'm so excited about our emerging partnership with Rafael Landivar and the work of Guatemala Sin Hambre. Is what we intend to do is bring everyone together, bring the state, bring civil society, bring religious communities, bring the private sector, bring researchers, bring industry together, and you bring your expertise, whether you're a climate scientist or a corruption expert or a violence reduction person, or you work in food provision or nutrition. And we have to do this all at once, but we have to do it together in a coordinated and strategic way. The second thing I think we need to recognize, especially at an event like this, is that it's going to look different in different communities. And a comprehensive food security strategy is going to look different even within communities. So thinking back to Guatemala here. The food security challenges that Guatemala faces in urban areas are very different from rural areas, which are very different from indigenous communities. So even in a place like Guatemala, a comprehensive food security strategy is going to look different in different communities and different parts of the country. The bad news for that is that it's overwhelming, right? I get that, right? How am I supposed to address all 5 C's all at once in one place in all these ways? The good news is there's a place for you at the table, right? There is a role for all of us. You bring your skills, your expertise, your knowledge, your dreams, your vision, and we get to work doing this work together. It's not overwhelming if we're all in this together.
Thank you all very much. Very insightful responses. I'm wondering if, we've been talking about global hunger. I'm wondering if there's anything that we've left out that you think is crucial to sort of convey about the situation in the world today and what it would mean to move forward.
Well, as we look forward, we've been talking about the 5 C's. I think you got to be aware of the 4 F's, okay? And so that's food. Obviously, we're going to have a food availability problem. That's what a lot of experts are predicting, because we have access to fertilizer problem. we have increased fuel costs, and we have increased finance costs. So the ability to finance food production and the 4 F's are going to have a big impact. So that might be next year's panel. This year was the 5 C's. Next year we'll be doing the 4 F's. But I think it's something that we have to be very mindful of, that the cost of doing this, especially access to credit for smallholder farmers, for others, is really going up. The cost for fertilizer in parts of Africa is up 300%. And so, their ability to produce food locally is going down. We expect a 30% decrease in food production in Africa this year. And that's going to have an impact on, and we're not able to import enough. So it's going to have an impact on the availability of food.
And I'll add some more letters. Yesterday I hadn't heard this until the other global food security breakout session yesterday from Matt Smith, is taking an approach with 3 Ps, with power, personalization, and proximity. So understanding how we can come together through a collective impact model, through a shared power approach to address these issues, creating personalized interventions that, Victor, as you were saying, we tailor to unique contexts and get right in communities that look different and within the same area. And then proximity. We have proximity to the problem. We can't do this alone. We can't do this from the United States. We have to do it with partners on the ground, with in-country partners, and those in-country partners need to be the ones leading and driving the change.
Anything to add? All right. Well, we are out of time for our panel, but if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking our panel of experts for their insight.